I think a lot of people today are going to be Googling, who is Mike Johnson? Because many had never heard of him before this, unless, they were a fan of the amicus brief that he filed, I think, in Texas, contesting the election results. What can you tell us about our new speaker?
Well, the congressman from Louisiana is not super long tenured in this House of Representatives, Matt, which is maybe why a lot of people might not know who he is. He was only elected back in 2016. He hasn't held to this point any prominent leader positions other than being chair of the Republican Study Committee, which is a very conservative caucus. But this is really going to be his first go at a leadership position, and doing so as the Speaker of the House. So he definitely is going to come to much more prominence now. But as you already have been discussing, this is someone who was closely aligned with former President Trump. He was one of the leaders of the effort in the House to not certify the results of the 2020 election. And he is very much a conservative. He is very pro-life. He was very opposed to gay marriage. You actually had one congresswoman who is married to a woman giving her wife an anniversary shout out before voting for Hakeem Jeffries in the roll call vote just moments ago. But this is definitely a conservative, someone who appeals to a lot of the hardline members of this Republican conference. But because he hasn't been so well known, he also hasn't collected a lot of animosity. He hasn't made many enemies internally, and ultimately that seems like is why he was able to get over the finish line today when several others before him could not.
And Kailey, I guess timing is important too, as the clock continues here without a House Speaker up until now. Some talking about the Republicans essentially wasting their majority status. How much was that part of this story building as we waited to see who ultimately would fill these shoes?
Oh, it absolutely was. I mean, this was day 22 without a Speaker of the House, and everybody knows we're working against a clock here because funding for the U.S. government runs out on November 17th. That, as well as funding for Israel, the supplemental request that has come down from the White House to aid not just Israel, but also Ukraine, Taiwan, and border security measures as well, is something that needs to be addressed and couldn't be addressed until there was a Speaker of the House. So there definitely was a sense of urgency that it was time to get this done. Congressman Ralph Norman of North Carolina was actually speaking with reporters ahead of the vote, and he just said, look, he mentioned timing, and he said Mike Johnson is the right man at the right time. It just was a feeling, it seemed, here on Capitol Hill that, all right, guys, we got to get this done.
It'll be interesting to see if Johnson is an isolationist, like many on the very right of his party, whether or not he opposes more aid to Ukraine or in the levels that it's been requested, and whether or not he feels the same way about aid to Israel. What do we know about his voting record?
Well, Mike Johnson, as the Speaker designee, actually spoke to journalists and reporters this morning before heading into the vote and suggested that he wouldn't be opposed to more aid to Ukraine. Of course, we'll actually see once he has the gavel in hand what will be done about that. But he also was outlining plans for spending, the idea that a continuing resolution will be needed to continue to fund the U.S. government. He suggested there could be a CR, a temporary funding measure that would fund the government from January 15th or to January 15th or possibly to April 15th. He said that's something that he was going to have to discuss with the conference and sort out. But a lot of that policy is going to be ironed out once the gavel was actually in hand. That was what he needed to achieve first. And again, he's done that today.
Kailey, you mentioned the risk of a shutdown as we move into next month as one of the considerations that is fast approaching. Many of the hardliners had been resisting a leader who voted for the budget deal that McCarthy had struck with President Biden earlier this year. How does the conversation around that immediately start to take shape? What's going to happen with the possibility of a shutdown moving into November?
Well, this is one of the difficult challenges that Johnson will have to navigate as Speaker. As I already mentioned, this is not someone with a great deal of leadership experience, and he may be very quickly forced to go into a room with Hakeem Jeffries, the Democratic leader, Chuck Schumer, and Mitch McConnell, the leaders in the Senate, possibly even President Biden, to try to figure out how to keep the U.S. government funded, what kind of bipartisan dealing will have to be made. But you're very right. It was working in a bipartisan manner that helped doom Kevin McCarthy's speakership in the first place, so it's going to be a tricky line to walk. What Mike Johnson may have working for him, though, though, is, as I said, he is actually much more appealing to a lot of those hardline conservatives that Kevin McCarthy had such a problem with. It'll be interesting to see if he can get things over the finish line that they wouldn't have necessarily agreed to under the prior speakership, but if he can actually get that done. It is, though, going to definitely be a challenge for him. And again, there's not time to pass all of these separate appropriations bills that would be needed to keep the government open by November 17th. It seems it just isn't that much time that we're working with. So a continuing resolution is likely what it's going to take. And there is some pushback in certain parts of the Republican conference to that kind of idea.